Continuing with Spinoza's Metaphysics, we now look at his ontological argument from God's existence. The basic idea of any ontological argument is that it's an a priori argument based on pure reason, which relies on the definition of God. And the simplest version, not Spinoza's, is essentially this. God is perfect, so he must exist, because if he didn't exist he wouldn't be perfect, but he is, so he does, roughly put. So Spinoza's version's rather more complicated, and here's how it goes. It begins with his definition of substance. He defines it as that which is in itself and is conceived through itself, and that the conception of which does not need the conception of another thing from which it must be. So, if A substance, had a cause, then B, to understand that substance, we would have to have knowledge of its cause. This is from his Axiom 4. Part B of Premise 2 contradicts Spinoza's definition of substance. Thus, a substance cannot have a cause. Now, according to his definition 6, God is a substance. So, since God does not have a cause, God must necessarily exist. Now, to distill down essentially what he's doing, again, is standard ontological argument with a lot of, Spinoza twist to it. But the gist is that you define God a certain way, and by this definition, God must exist. So in this case, he ends up defining God in such a way that if, that God must exist because he cannot have a cause, and since he must not have a cause, he must necessarily exist. So that's his reasoning, at least in the ontological argument of Spinoza. Now, the ontological argument, of course, his version of it is unique to him. It does a lot of unusual things there. But what makes Spinoza, sort of stand out is that not only does he argue for God, which is, done by philosophers like Descartes and Locke and so forth, he argues that there is not just one God, but that all there is God. Namely, there is one substance, that substance is God, and there's nothing else. And that's a pretty radical claim. So how does he support this extreme claim? Well, he advances the following reasoning. So if there was a second substance, then there are two possibilities here. It either has the same nature as God or a different nature. And this has got to, this is true. Either it is just like God or it's not. Only two possibilities. So, could it have the same nature as God? Well, he says that it could not have this. It could not have the same nature of God, because if it did, the two would be indistinguishable, and hence one and not two. And so, his reasoning here is that things are just differentiated by or individuated by their nature. And so if two things are the same nature, they're not two, they're one. And I always use the example of, Clark Kent and Superman here. Sorry, spoilers. So they're two different names, Clark Kent, Superman. But of course, they have the same nature, and they're the same person. So they're not two people, they're one. So what if we did have a second substance that had a nature like God's, but somehow was still what's called numerically distinct? That's to say that it's the same as God. Numerically distinct means that it's, literally what it says, that there are two rather than one in this case. It's different because it is a second thing. Now, he reasons here that there would need to be a reason outside of the nature of these two entities. We'll call them, G1 and G2, as to why there are only two and not three or more. So he raises, this point. If we have two entities that are, exactly the same, but are numerically distinct, God 1, God 2, he claims there's got to be a reason outside of them, outside their nature, why there are, two and not 3, 4, 5, etc. So here is where he brings in his definition of substance, because he claims there cannot be any reason external to a substance as to why it exists, by definition. So if we accept that definition, that that's the way they have to work, then yes, that's the way they have to work. So from this, it follows there cannot be a substance like God, but numerically distinct, because the way he defines substance. Now, God is also, for Spinoza, infinite in his attributes. So if another substance differs from God, it must be different from God by lacking at least one of his infinite perfections. But if this entity is a substance, it must exist independently of God by definition, because that's the definition of substance. But he says this is absurd because the second substance would limit God's nature. So he infers it follows that God is the only substance, and everything else that exists is but a mode of his being. And mode of his being is a fancy way of saying it's kind of like it's a quality of God. To quote him, he says, "Whatever is in God, and nothing can either be or be conceived without God." Now, one way to put kind of the last part of his argument is to think about it being like a case of being perfect is like having all the money in the world. And if you have all the money in the world, that means there can't even be a single other person who has a penny, because then you wouldn't have all the money in the world. So if God is, utterly perfect, but you had another entity existing apart from God, that would limit God. Again, going with the money analogy, if you have every dollar, everything except the one penny I have, you still don't have all the money, because I just have, even if I have that one penny. Likewise, if there's anything apart from God, then that would limit God. But by definition, according to Spinoza, God can't be limited. He's got to have everything. So the way he argues this, in a way, makes sense. If God must have everything, there can be nothing outside of God. And so he ends up embracing the idea that not only is there one God, which is pretty standard to Christianity, Islam, etc., but there is only one, and that is God. It's not that there's one God, there is, for Spinoza. There's just one, and that's God. Nothing else in the world. Now, this view, of course, has a name. It's called pantheism. Theism relating to deities, pan, it's, covering everything. So for Spinoza, God is everything. And he's also immanent rather than transcendent. And you might recall when we talked about, universals, immanent means that they're here, transcendent means that they're some not here. Like Plato's forms. Plato's forms are transcendent universals. They're in a Platonic heaven. They're not here. Aristotle's universals are immanent, so they're here. So God, of course, has to be immanent rather than transcendent, because there is no not here to be. Everything is God. So he's a pantheist. Now, most theological thinkers, thinkers in the Middle Ages, before Spinoza, etc., and most theological thinkers afterwards, have an account of the relationship between God and the created world. But Spinoza doesn't, because there's not two entities. There's not God in the world. There's just God. And so for him, reality is, again, one being. It's that eternal and infinite being whom we call God, or alternatively we can call it nature. So the medieval thinkers, Christian thinkers, some Islamic thinkers, etc., claim everything depended on God. He goes beyond that. It's not that everything depends on God because God created them. It's that all individual things are merely modes or modifications of God's attributes. Kind of roughly put, we're like God's qualities or properties. Or put, kind of a not entirely correct metaphor, we're like ingredients of God. So you can think of like you get like a box of cereal, and we're part, each of us make up some of the stuff, in there. We're little bits of it. Although we're not really bits because we're not separate parts. So, on traditional theology, again, in Christianity, Islam, etc., for the most part, they present God as a person. And they present God as thinking, willing, planning, choosing, etc. Spinoza denies all this. He says, neither intellect nor will pertain to the nature of God. Now, a critic, not surprisingly, had critics who take the more traditional view that God is a person, and he replied back in a way that's almost, Freudian. He said, not Freudian in that way, but in the sense that, God is a matter of psychology. Spinoza said in response to this critic that seeing God as a person is just psychology. It's a psychological need to see God in one's own image. And he says, I'm not sure if he was, being humorous or not, but he's probably rather serious. He says that if a triangle or circle could speak, they would see God's nature as eminently triangular or circular. That he being that, beings would tend to cast God in their own image. And so he claims that each, quoting him, translated of course, ascribes to God its own attributes, assuming itself to be like God, and regarding all else as ill-formed. Which is an interesting point, not only like in terms of the qualities of God we attribute to God, but one might note that people tend to cast God as sharing their fears, their prejudices, their beliefs, their likes and dislikes. And so, as you might imagine, Spinoza got in a fair amount of trouble because of this. Because as we noted earlier, he got excommunicated, and there was an assassination attempt upon him. So, a recap of God for Spinoza is, ontological argument that God must exist by definition. So, a priori argument for God. He also has the argument there must be one and only one substance, and this is God. And so he ends up embracing pantheism. Everything is God. And this God is not a person in the usual sense. And as you can see, all these claims, pantheism, taking God to not be a person, got him into quite a bit of trouble. As we saw at the beginning, Spinoza takes the view that everything that happens by necessity. It's a deterministic world. Now, he makes two claims that seem to contradict each other when he's talking about freedom and necessity, talking about God. He claims that God alone is a free cause, but he also says this, that God does not act from freedom of the will. And that would seem to be a contradiction, because we would naturally tend to think, well, if God alone is a free cause, then he's free. But then he says God does not act from freedom of the will, so how do those two go together? Well, here's how he dissolves the apparent contradiction. So for Spinoza, God is a free cause, in that his actions are neither compelled nor determined by anything external. So for him, not being free would mean that one is controlled by something outside of oneself. You could use like a sci-fi example, like one of Robert Heinlein's puppet masters, or like Stargate, the Goa'uld, take control of something. Or if you want to do like some supernatural stuff, like a demon possessing someone. But for Spinoza, God is the free cause because there's nothing external to him. Because if you are free, if there's nothing external compelling you, and there's nothing external to you, then you are, by definition, free. So kind of a clever way of doing that. Now, God, though, does not have freedom of the will because the laws of his nature determine his actions. And God does not choose his nature. Why not? Well, his nature, for Spinoza, is a matter of necessity. God must of logical necessity be God. And so he is what he is because he must be what he is. He can't be otherwise. And he does what he does because he is what he is. And of course, he must be what he is because he can't be otherwise. So he does what he does, and he cannot do otherwise. So he threads the needle here, goes to the two horns of the dilemma by saying that God is free of external determination, so God alone is a free cause, but he's determined internally by his nature, so God does not act from freedom of the will. And this approach is sometimes used by other philosophers in the context of free will for us, for humans, that you are free if you're acting in accord with internal stuff, as opposed to being controlled from the outside. But of course, if everything we do is determined by all the neurochemical processes in our brain, then we are determined. And as you might imagine, some people find that not particularly satisfying. But free will is a tough debate. So that's Spinoza's view. God is free because there's nothing outside of God to compel him, but he's determined because God is what he is, so he does what he does because he is what he is, and he can't be otherwise and can't do otherwise. So what about creation and necessity? Now, most of the traditional views of creation, kind of the standard religious story about creation, is that God chooses to create the world and makes it so. For Spinoza, though, no. Why not? Well, according to Spinoza, things could have been produced by God in no other manner and in no other order than that in which they have been produced. Why not? Well, Spinoza claims that there is no contingency in nature. There is no chance, there is no choice, because the world follows by necessity from God's nature. And God's nature, as said multiple times, is what it is by necessity. So God must be God, and God does what he does because he is God, and he must be God, so he must do what he does. He cannot do otherwise. And also the world is God, so that's why the world can't be otherwise, because the world is God for Spinoza. So for Spinoza, there's two types of events. There are events that are necessary, that is, that must occur, and these are also the actual events. So everything that has occurred, is occurring, and will occur, must occur, cannot be otherwise. So no chance, no choice. So actual events are also, ones that actually are also necessary events. Now, many other philosophers separate those. There are those that, events that must occur, or things that must be, and then the ones that actually are. All necessary events would be actual, by definition, of course, because they must be, they will be. But most philosophers don't do the reverse, that being actual doesn't mean that something is therefore necessary. So what is the other type of event? Well, in a way they're non-events, because some events are impossible, and of course they do not occur. So everything that occurs must occur, everything that doesn't occur cannot occur. To quote Spinoza, translated of course, all things follow from the eternal decree of God, according to that same necessity, by which it follows from the essence of a triangle that it is 3 angles are equal to 2 right angles. So essentially what he's saying is that the world works in the same way that the necessary truth of triangles having 3 sides work. So for Spinoza, that President Obama was elected in 2012 could not have been otherwise. Triangles have 3 sides. Obama had to be elected in 2012. And the result of the upcoming election, which we don't know because we lack knowledge, but for God it's just as evident as, triangles having 3 sides. Now, so God's decrees are not decisions on his part. He doesn't have to, say this is how it's going to be. For Spinoza, everything happens by logical necessity. Nothing could be different. So there's no need to make a decision because there's no other way it can be. To use an analogy, if you're drawing a triangle, you have to draw 3 sides. There's no choice of, 4 or 5 or 6. It's got to be 3-sided. And everything, according to Spinoza, works like that. Everything is necessary. Now, this also entails that there is no purpose. Why not? Well, this may seem odd because normally when you have God in the picture, people talk about God's plan, God's will. And teleological universes, kind of one very common version is when you have God. But in this case, there is no purpose. Why? Well, it's not because things are meaningless in a way, but it's because purpose implies seeking something that is lacking. So if you have a purpose, that means, at least according to Spinoza, there's something that you have to do, which means you're missing something. So if you're doing something, with a purpose, listening to this to do better on a quiz that you haven't taken yet, it means that you're lacking something, namely the desired grade on the quiz. So God has no purpose in this sense because he's not lacking. And so everything is inevitable. Nothing could have been different. Nothing is different than it must be, and nothing will be different than what it must be. So what about our free will? Well, as you might imagine, if God doesn't have free will, then it would certainly make sense that we don't either. We, of course, tend to think we do, but for Spinoza, free will is an illusion. So why do we believe in it? Well, ignorance, essentially. We believe in free will because of the literal definition of ignorance. We do not know. And according to Spinoza, what we don't know is the divine nature and how everything proceeds by necessity from that nature. So we believe we have free will because we just don't know how things work. And he uses a sort of an appeal to intuition here, where he says that if a stone was thrown through the air and it were conscious, it would think it was free to choose to move and land where it does. It would, in a way, kind of like delude itself. And he thinks we're like that stone. That although we're obviously more complicated in what we do, but we think we're choosing, but we're not. So we think we're free because we're conscious of our own actions, but we're ignorant of the causes by which those actions are determined. In modern terms, we don't know how all the, we don't have a full understanding of our own neurochemistry or biology, the social factors influencing us. Put metaphorically, we can't see our inner matrix. We can't see our own code. And using that metaphor, if we were like a robot who could see their own code, we would know this. We would know that we are not free. Or so he claims. So everything is determined. God's not free. We're not free, at least in the sense of having free will. Now, one of the things we saw with our good dead friend Descartes was the classic mind-body problem. Namely, if you have mind and if you have body, how do these two interact? Now, one solution, of course, is to go straight up materialism, say there's no problem there. Others to go immaterialism, like Berkeley, and say no problem there. So how does Spinoza deal with this? And as you might imagine, he deals with it in kind of a strange way. So Spinoza looks at the matter of God's attributes, his qualities. And for him, an attribute is this, quoting him, that which the intellect perceives of substance as constituting its essence. So basically, what we perceive of a substance as making up what it is. So in the case of like a triangle, imagine a triangle with a substance, we would see it as three-sided would be an attribute. Now he does claim, and this is something that would be shared by most thinkers who think about God, that thought is one of God's attributes. So God does think. But then he kind of breaks pretty heavily with the usual view. He claims that extension is an attribute of God, or put another way, God is an extended thing. So God has thought as an attribute, but also extension as an attribute. Now, we, of course, cannot understand all of God's attributes because we have finite minds. And Spinoza claims that God has an infinite number of attributes, but we can only understand, well, he says essentially two of them, thought and extension. Now, this would seem to set up a bit of a, again, mind-body problem, because you've got thought, and then you also have extension. So how do these two relate? Well, what he ends up doing is rejecting Hobbes, rejecting Descartes. You might recall our good dead friend Hobbes is an example of philosophical materialism or philosophical physicalism, the view that all that exists is matter or physical. So Spinoza rejects that and claims that thought cannot be understood in purely physical terms. But he doesn't embrace Cartesian dualism. Why? Well, what he says is this: the mind and body are one and the same thing, conceived at one time under the attribute of thought, and at another under that of extension. That somehow, crudely put, it's kind of like how you look at it. Kind of like those optical illusions, like, duck, rabbit type of scenarios. Bad metaphor, but kind of similar idea. So, if he says, you can't, explain thought in purely physical terms, but then he says the mind and body are one and the same thing, well, that seems a lot like either materialism, where mind and body are one, namely their matter, or like Berkeley's, phenomenalism, or idealism, where everything is mind and body are one, and that they're both mental. So what Spinoza embraces is what's called dual aspect theory. Physical events are mental events, and mental events are physical events. This seems pretty odd because, well, it is pretty odd. So how would this work? Well, in a way you could take the view that maybe God makes it work because, God. So take an object, any object you want, like an apple. Any object would be a mode of God. And as such, is nature, what we call like the natural world, in terms of the attribute of extension. But you can also see the same object in terms of the attributes of thought. The object is an idea in the mind of God. So the apple, in a way, you could see him as kind of smushing together Berkeley and, Hobbes in a way. That there is just, there's not dualism, there's not mind substance, body substance, but there is, the apple that is a mode of God, which would be, extended, but also the idea in God's mind, which would be rather like Berkeley. And I mentioned before that this seems to rely on, God. And here's how it works. God is omniscient, unlike us. So his idea contains everything that's in the object. The idea and the object are identical. So because God is omniscient, his ideas are objects. His objects are ideas. This wouldn't work for us because we're finite and limited. But for Spinoza, he takes thought and extension to both be self-contained, and we can understand them independently. So what does this mean? Well, he claimed that the language of thought cannot be reduced to the language of extension. Also, the language of extension can't be reduced to the language of thought. And so he ends up with kind of seemingly may consider it sort of like bizarre and cheating, but he's essentially saying, yes, you can think of the apple as an object and an idea. You can't reduce the object to the idea or the idea to the object, but they're not two separate things. They're one, but also one is thought, one is extension. So they're, if you wanted to be a bit sarcastic, you could say there are two that are one and one that are two. But they're also just one, and so confusing. So unlike Descartes, who clearly divides reality, you've got physical substance, you've got mental substance. For Spinoza, you can use either category to describe the whole of reality. To use a kind of a bad metaphor, you could like close one eye, look at it one way, close the other eye, look at it another way, and you're still, describing everything. You're seeing, everything. So to quote him, when things are considered as modes of thought, we must explain the order of the whole nature, or the connection of causes, by the attribute of thought alone. And when things are considered as modes of extension, the order of the whole nature must be explained through the attribute of extension alone. Again, weird and confusing, but it does seem to kind of work because of God. And again, the idea is that given that God's omniscient, his idea is, a perfect idea. May not be, the entity itself would not be perfect, but it's a perfect idea. So his idea lacks nothing, so it's the same as the object. But it's not the object, but it is. And the object, of course, is the idea, but it also is not. Yeah, so very confusing. And no, as you might imagine, get a lot of criticism.